Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of Minecraft Disney World. This week we're taking a look at the Studio Backlot Tour at what is now Disney's Hollywood Studios, what was previously Disney's MGM Studios. This is an interesting attraction because it is still around today. It's evolved a lot, but it sort of has a history that sort of shows how different the approach of MGM Studios at the time really was as a theme park. This is an attraction that opened on May 1st, 1989, which is when MGM Studios opened. And what it was a extremely long tour of what was going to be, at the time, a completely functional studio. Michael Eisner at the time had conceived of the idea of making this hybrid of a functional studio and a half-day theme park that you'd be able to mesh together. There's sort of some controversy around the history of it that I'll get to in a little bit, but for now I'm going to just sort of focus on the attraction itself. Today, it stands as a 35-minute tour where it's a mix of a walking tour and a tram tour. You sort of go through and you're shown how like special effects work. You get to see a lot of props from a lot of Disney movies, and then you get on a tram and you get driven around to take a look at larger props like airplanes and cars and stuff like that from famous movies. And then you go through this ride portion called Catastrophe Canyon that sort of puts you in the middle of an action scene being shot, and then it sort of all closes off with a tour. The exit queue, which is sort of like a gift shop now, is also almost like a museum exhibit about AFI's top 50 villains in cinema. So you get, it's a great attraction if you're into film and you're like a cinephile, but there's sort of like a really cool history about it. For one, as far as the history of the ride, at 35 minutes, it's considered a long attraction, but it's actually a lot shorter than it originally was. In the original version, in the first few years, almost the entire back part of the park, from the animation studios area where you have the Little Mermaid and all the Toy Story Pixar place area, to all the streets of New York and basically anything in between, was all for this tour at the time. In fact, the tour actually drove through the streets of New York / streets of America, but because the park ended up being so popular, they sort of took that part out of the tour, and they also opened it up for sort of walking for guests, so what guests could go through. There was more to it too. In fact, the tour was so long that at one point there was a stop in the middle where you could take a break. In fact, if you go outside of the Backlot Tour today, there's sort of a food court area near the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids spot, and that was originally intended and built to be the midway point for the Backlot Tour. So people would take the tram tour, and that would be half of it, and then they would get off and they would have an opportunity to go to the bathroom, get food, rest for a few minutes, and then they would continue on with a walking tour, which happened along that whole backlot street where today is now Pixar's the Toy Story Midway Mania and the Narnia and Walt One Man's Dream. All of that was originally not those specific things being part of the tour, but those spaces were used for this walking tour about how film was created. And again, Eisner intended this to be a functional studio. There was a costume department and an animation area where his goal was to have actual people working there on actual Disney productions, including actual sets to film television shows and things like that. And the controversial part that I mentioned earlier is the fact that it seems very similar to Universal Studios, and Universal Studios has a backlot tour. And there's some people who believe that this theme park exists because it was Michael Eisner's way of competing with Universal. Now, what's interesting is Universal announced their plans for a park in Orlando first, based on the movies, which would include a tour, but Disney's MGM Studios ended up opening sooner, and the reason for that is because what was really smart and really forward-thinking was Walt realized that in order to have a park that was on the cutting edge, you couldn't rely on breaking through the red tape of sort of government regulations and like their normal health standard. Like how can you get through the red tape of building code when you're trying to build something that's completely new and hasn't been done before? So what he did is he had the area that he bought set up into almost its own miniature government called the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And since they had their own oversight, they were able to build faster and get construction done sooner. So as a result, even though MGM was announced after Universal Studios, MGM opened first, and it was probably done for less of a cost than Universal. And because Universal wasn't as well versed in the theme park business at that time, they sort of struggled at the beginning, and sort of the public perception at the time was that Disney did it first and Universal copied, which probably made people at Universal pretty angry. But yeah, there was this long tour. They converted a lot of it, broke it down. I think it's probably for the better. There used to be a large section of this ride where there were actual homes that they would use as establishing shots. Like the Golden Girls house was on this area of the tour, and they actually removed that whole section, and that became the Lights, Motors action stunt show. So it seems like Disney's on this trend where they are continually breaking it down, but I think that's because there is this upward trend of us as guests wanting shorter experiences. And so you could still have, the Narnia, for instance. The Making of Narnia sort of gives you a look into the making of Narnia. It's something you would see on a backlot tour, except now it's its own attraction. So if you want to sort of a la carte pick and choose what aspects of this tour you want to enjoy, you can do so. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see it cut down more and more as we go on until there's just a bare minimum of it. And in 2008, Imagineering replaced the live touring on the trams with a automated spiel. So there's either further signs of sort of making the attraction more efficient, and it's is what it is. I think it's a fun attraction. I think at 35 minutes, it is a time investment, but because you have the tram aspect of it, you do get to sit down and relax for a while. Of course, it's a tram outdoors, so you're not going to escape the heat necessarily. I think personally, as a big fan of film, I enjoy going on it every time, especially because Disney has so many studios at their disposal. I think you see a high turnaround of props that are used in the tour, which is really nice, and it sort of keeps it fresh. So if you're in Disney's Hollywood Studios and you're back there and maybe you don't want to wait on the whole 3-hour line to get onto Toy Story Midway Mania, if you just keep on walking, you'll run into the Studio Backlot Tour, and I think you could have a fun time with it. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you join me next week when we take another Disney World attraction on the mcmagic.us server, and we talk a little bit about the history. Bye, everyone.